To all my gamers and NFT players, Viral Hip Hop News and the Lightest Fair Network have teamed up to bring you something revolutionary in the gaming and NFT space. Go to play.finesse.fun right now to play the season preview of the game Finesse Shadow Warriors exclusively on play.finesse.fun. Don't be the last to be a part of this new technological advancement in gaming and NFT. Play.finesse.fun to play the season preview of the game Finesse Shadow Warriors. Link is in the description box. Let them know Viral Hip Hop News sent you. Let's go.
Welcome to another episode of the Hip Hop Uncensored podcast. I'm your brother, O-God, from Hip Hop News Uncensored, and sitting across from me is my co-host.
What up, y'all? It's your man, Sam, and Viral Hip Hop News. Like my cousin said, man, you're in the building for a very special edition of the Hip Hop Uncensored podcast. And we got a very special guest in the building.
Yes.
Legendary educator, Miss Jane Elliott is on the podcast. How you doing this afternoon?
I'm doing just fine. If you're talking to me, I'm doing fine.
Good. Thank you, and appreciate you coming on this afternoon. Like I said, I know you laughed when I said you were legendary, but to us, listening to you and hearing you throughout these decades, you're most certainly legendary to us. So we thank you for all your work. Let's just get right into it, because we're living in a day and age that's very interesting. We just came off of a very heated election. So in your opinion, in 2021, the very early beginning of 2021, how are you looking at the world as we see it today?
If we can change the minds of 40% of the Republicans in the country, we may swing this thing back to a democracy. If we don't, we're in danger of taking this democracy off the hill. These are scary times, because 40% of the Republicans absolutely support a boy grown tall who had no business being in the presidency in the first place, has never developed an adult ego state. He's a case of arrested development, and many of the people who are following him are in the same situation.
Right. And they talk a lot about Donald Trump, and you say, what was the main reason that he got elected? Can you go back over that again? What do you think the main reason was he got elected anyway?
The main reason he got elected was we gave him too much attention. The media gave him too much attention. He didn't have to run for the presidency. Didn't cost him a dime, because every time he opened his mouth, every time he blew his nose, which he didn't do very often, every time he did anything, the media covered it. We've got to stop covering him, and we shouldn't be talking about him right now, except as a cautionary tale. Let me tell you how I know how dangerous he is. I was born in 1933, the year that Adolf Hitler and Franklin Roosevelt came to power in their respective countries. I watched my father just ranting for 12 years, from 1933 till 1945, when the Second World War was over. I heard my father ranting about the horrible things that Adolf Hitler was doing in Germany, and then all over Europe. And then I lived to be this age, and 4 years ago, I watched the same things happen in this country that I watched when I was from birth to the age of 12. This man did exactly what Hitler did, and he was determined to succeed the way Hitler did. And if you think I'm mistaken about that, then you need to get the book When at Times the Mob is Swayed by Bert Newborn. When I first saw him behaving in these ways, I thought, this is Hitlerian. Why aren't people paying attention? And then I thought I was exaggerating. It was my imagination. You know how old women are. And then I read that book, and I realized that in that fool's bedside table, in a locked drawer, he has a copy of Adolf Hitler's writings, The New World Order. You need to take a very close look at this fool, because he's going to try to do again what Hitler did from 1933 till 1945. Now, he didn't succeed, but he left in his wake 40% of the Republican Party who don't know any better than to support this fool.
You brought up Hitler, you brought up being born in 1933, and it immediately thought about our grandparents. And our grandfather was born in 1917, and I believe our grandmother was born in the 20s, no longer here now, God rest their souls. One of the things I regret the most is not being able to sit down with my grandfather and grandmother and talk to them and get their perspective on what they seen from a bird's eye view back when they grew up. So if you don't mind, just kind of giving us a perspective of what you've seen and how you were introduced to race in general growing up in Iowa as a child.
Well, I was introduced to race as a child growing up in Iowa was the same thing. Many people are being introduced to race in Iowa today. I think something like 3 or 4% of the population of Iowa is other than what we call white. Now, everybody's getting the same ridiculous training about race that I did, unfortunately. We are convinced that there are white people and there are black people. Now, I'm sitting here looking at this picture of me, and I can see where my hair leaves off and my skin begins. My hair is white, my shirt white, my skin isn't. I can see where your hair leaves off and where your skin begins. Your hair is black, your shirts are black, your skin isn't. We have used those two words to separate people for long enough. White and black are polar opposites. And if you read the definition of white in the dictionary, white is purity and sinless. Black is ugly and dangerous. Kids hear the words white and black when they read folk tales. In the songs, we get the same kind of ugly information about whiteness and blackness. If you're born white, you're all right. If you're born black, you better stand back. Until we stop using those two words, we can plan on having blatant racism in the United States of America, because we are not educating people in this country. We are indoctrinating them to the myth of the rightness of whiteness. We've got to start teaching people from kindergarten, from preschool on, pre-birth. We've got to convince people that we all came from the same ancestors. You and I are 30th to 50th cousins because we all three have the same ancestors, and they evolved in sub-Saharan Africa between 300,000 and 500,000 years ago. Now it's time to get over the idea that there's more than one race. There's only one race on the face of the earth, and that's the human race. And we three are all members of the same race. You are my cousins, like it or not.
Now
it's time to change the training. Yeah.
Right. Have you ever heard of Dr. Frances Cress Welsing?
Yes. Oh my, of course. The woman's brilliant.
Right. Yeah. She has the color confrontation theory as well. And that was the thing that she said, that, like you said, like, if you're white, you're right. You're black, get back. If you're brown, stick around, or something like that. What do you think about her teachings? And right.
I learned more from Frances Cress Welsing than I've ever learned from anyone else. I also learned a whole lot from, oh my goodness, I could go down the list of names of people of color that I have read, and it just boggles my mind that we aren't teaching what people like Frances Cress Welsing told us. The woman, I'm not sure she's still living, is she?
No, she passed away a few years ago. Yeah.
That's what I thought. Everybody should read her book, because everybody should read everything she ever wrote, because the woman was brilliant, absolutely brilliant. And if I know anything, most of what I've learned from her, because she knew so much.
In your opinion, or to your best of your recollection, when did they begin weaponizing the colors? When did they start weaponizing black and white and putting it against one another?
During the Spanish Inquisition, they deliberately did that. According to what I've read, during the Spanish Inquisition, the Torquemada and company were trying to turn everybody Catholic. So they killed people who they thought weren't Catholic, and then suddenly realized they had killed a whole bunch of Christians. They didn't want to kill everybody. They don't want to kill Christians. They just want to kill those who weren't Christians. So then they decided they had to find a way to decide whether someone was a Christian or not. And they couldn't tell what your religion was by looking at you. So they decided they would use skin color to decide who probably wasn't Christian. And that's when this whole thing started. In the late 1400s, early 1500s, you need to realize that there's a book out there that everybody should read. It's called The Myth of Race by Robert Wald Sussman. Everybody should read that book. And you should also read, it's still in print, and you should also read, he wrote, it'll come to me because I've been quoting it for years. But anyway, read Robert Wald Sussman's book, The Myth of Race, and you'll realize that what I'm telling you isn't coming out of my head, it's coming out of what I've read and what I believe is true. We're all members of the same race. To put white and black against one another, you create a chasm that you cannot cross, because white is the color of goodness and black is the color of evil. We've got to get over that. We've got to realize, get the National Geographic magazine for April of 2018. Have you seen this magazine? You see this cover?
Wow.
These two girls are sisters. Yeah, these two girls are sisters. Their father's black and their mother's white. Supposedly, that's the colors we use. Now, would you call these girls biracial?
According to our society, yes, but I don't immediately think biracial. No.
Well, they aren't biracial because there's only one race on the face of the earth. They are different colors, but they are not biracial. There's no such thing as a biracial person. Now, if you get this magazine, you'll also find this in the middle of the magazine. I cut them out and had them laminated. These are different colors of human beings. See these very, very dark people on here? They are very, very dark, but they are not black. This guy is very, very dark, but he's not black. Every one of these pictures has a number underneath it and the word Pantone. All these colors are found on the Pantone color scale. Now, you'll notice that there are no people on any of these pictures that are this color, because people don't come in this color. And there aren't any that are this color. People, we don't come in black and white. We come in shades of brown. Every person on the face of the earth is a shade of brown. And you can go to the thesaurus, look up synonyms for brown, and you'll find in one thesaurus, you'll find almost 100 synonyms for brown. In another thesaurus, you'll find about 45. Everybody needs to see all those synonyms. Go through those synonyms, find one that you think probably matches the color of your skin, look it up in the dictionary and find out whether that might in fact be the color of your skin, and start using that instead of white and black. As long as it's white and black, it will be white against black. Make no mistake about that. This whole business. And then while you're looking at this magazine, and everybody should, there will be those who will say, well, my people didn't come from Africa. Well, if your people didn't come from Africa, no matter what your color is, your people must have come from another planet. Because that's the only people on the face of the earth. People on the face of the earth all came from Africa, right here. See this place right here? This shows you where human beings evolved and how they moved from that area to populate every landmass on the face of the earth. And those people were very dark skinned because their bodies were exposed to a lot of sunlight, so their bodies produced a lot of melanin. So they were very dark skinned, but as they moved farther and farther from the equator, their bodies produced less and less melanin because they were exposed to less and less sunlight. So their skin, their hair, and their eyes got lighter. Their brains didn't get smaller, and their brains didn't get larger. Their skin, their hair, and their eyes got lighter. You need to realize that if every person listening to me today, if anybody's still listening, and I'm sure some millennials have turned off because they don't want to give up white and black, but if you're listening to me, get your DNA traced back as far as you can trace it. And no matter what your color, what you think your color is, and what you think your race is, you're going to find out that you, in your DNA, a percentage of your DNA came from a country in Africa. That's the way it is, because that's where we all came from. So, I think instead of calling ourselves black and white, we could call ourselves melanemic for white folks. If you're anemic, if you don't have enough iron in your blood, you're called anemic. If you don't have enough melanin in your skin to protect your cells from the rays of the sun, you must be melanemic. And if you have a lot of melanin in your skin, you're called melanotic. And melanotic is a word in the dictionary. So don't tell me I'm making all of this up, because I'm not. It's logical to call people melanemic or melanitis, melanaceous, melanemic, melanaceous, melanotic. Very little melanin, some melanin, a lot of melanin. And there's nothing negative or positive about melanin. But you need to realize, this will just kill you melanemic people who are listening. Of course, they've already left, I'm sure. Those of you who are melanemic and don't have much melanin in your skin need to realize that your lives are going to be shortened unless, and you won't have your grandchildren and your great-grandchildren's lives will be shortened unless you find someone with a lot of melanin in their skin with whom you will reproduce, so that your children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren can live after the hole in the ozone layer gets so big because of our ridiculous use of fossil fuels. The hole in the ozone layer is going to get so big that it's going to let in so much sunlight that melanemic people aren't going to live long. We already have too many people dying of melanoma, which is a skin color that you get because you don't have enough melanin in your skin to protect your cells from the damaging rays of the sun. You see, nature is going to take care of this whole thing for us. Make no mistake about that. And you need to remember that within 30 years, the demographics of this country say, within 30 years, melanemic white people will be a numerical minority in the United States of America. Now, you need to realize that, and you need to realize that that's the reason a whole lot of the 40% of the Republicans right now are scared to death. because they know that they're going to be a numerical minority in the future in this country, and they're scared to death that people of color are going to want to treat us the way we have treated them. You need to realize that that's happening. That's the reason we got a Donald Trump. That's the reason we have a border, a wall on the southern border of the United States. That fool said openly, we've got to keep those brown-skinned people out of here because those brown-skinned people reproduce too rapidly. He said that repeatedly, and they let him be the president of the United States. Then he decided, because in 1987, I believe, 60% of the fetuses that were aborted were white. Evidently, somebody told him about that. So he decided what we should do is close all the Planned Parenthood clinics, because 60% of the fetuses that were aborted in with the Planned Parenthood clinics and other places, not just Planned Parenthood, but several places, 60% of those were white fetuses. And he said, we've got to keep those white fetuses alive. We can solve our birth problem by keeping those white fetuses alive. So he closed most of the Planned Parenthood clinics. Now you need to realize that Planned Parenthood clinics furnish many, many valuable services to women of all kinds. It isn't just there for abortions. You need to realize that. You need to stop believing the nonsense that these people are telling in order to upset the apple cart. This apple cart has been around for 250 years without people like T. Rump destroying it. 40% of the Republicans could destroy our society as we know it. That's a pretty scary thought.
Absolutely. I was listening to an interview with James Baldwin, and the interview was conducted almost 50 years ago now. And he was talking to a young woman, and they were talking about police. And the things that he was describing reminds me of exactly what's happening today, what happened 10 years ago, what happened 10 years prior to that. And then we talk about the Trump effect, so to speak, where he kind of got these people with hatred almost out of, like they were dormant and they woke back up. But we've been seeing this throughout time. Let's talk about the relationship between police and African Americans in this country as it stands, because we've never had a good one. Why do you think that is?
Because of the education system in this country. Because we don't have an education system in this country, we have an indoctrination system in this country. We teach children how to be good American citizens. We need to teach children how to be good citizens of the world. And another thing, we've got to stop calling this country just America. You need to realize that we are so arrogant in this country that we think that America is the 48 contiguous states, Alaska, Hawaii, and the islands off the southeastern coast of the United States. That's not all there is to America, people. We've got to start dealing realistically with the social studies, because what we're teaching now is anti-social studies. You see this map?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
This is the map. This is the map that is used in schoolrooms throughout the United States, except in Boston. In Boston, they have gotten rid of this map. This is the Mercator map. Now, people, America is everything from the northernmost point of Canada to the southernmost point of South America. People who live in those, every one of these is an American. The people who live here and in Canada, those people live in the United States of America. We've got to start talking about this country as the United States of America instead of just America. You can't say God bless you and God bless America and then put a wall along the southern border of the United States and say we've got to keep those brown-skinned people out here. If you're going to God bless America, you have to bless the whole of America, which is all of South America, Central America, and North America. It's time to change our vocabulary and change the way we use words. Now, what was the question?
I was asking the relationship.
Oh, how have we changed? Oh, okay, it hasn't changed a bit, except to get worse, because now your father could say these ugly things about people of color, and if there were no people of color in your neighborhood, you could just take it in and you had nothing to question it. But now you can turn on television, or when I was a kid, when I was a teenager and a young adult, I could turn on television and see that all the things that my father said about different colors were right, because that's the way media was then. There were no people of color reading the news. There were no people of color in the commercials. There were virtually no people of color unless you were talking about crime. And then we grew somewhat, I thought. And then we elected Barack Obama. And I thought, now I don't have to do this work anymore. People are beginning to get smart. People are beginning to think it's going to be all right. I didn't realize that 40% would go underground, and with the help of Mitch McConnell, would keep Barack Obama from accomplishing all the things that he wanted to do. And they would pick somebody to run for the next election that would be totally opposite what Barack Obama was, opposite in every way. And that's what they did, because they are scared to death. Melanemic people, white folks, are scared to death of the fact that they're going to be a numerical minority in this country before very long. And they don't even realize that they have been a numerical minority all over the world forever. Only from 12 to 15% of the population of the earth can classify themselves as white. Yeah. Think about that. We have never been in the majority worldwide. So what makes us think that the world can't live without us directing their behaviors? Other countries have done without having melanemic people run the country. I think it's possible. And I know it's possible. I know if he had had good cooperation with Republicans when Barack Obama was president, we would have seen some remarkable things happen in this country. But right now, that party is still being run by T. Rump and Mitch McConnell, and that's unfortunate. It's not because they're their party. It's because of their ignorance, and it is self-imposed ignorance. Believing in the myth of several races is self-imposed ignorance. You could learn the truth if you decided to. It's out there.
Correct. Now, as far as racism or racist, would you say that all people who classify themselves as white are racist?
I would say that all people who classify themselves as white are ignorant and are willing to believe that white is a race. White is not a race. Black is not a race. Those are both skin colors. Those are color groups. They are not races. There's only one race of people on the face of the earth, and that's the human race. Human beings come in different sizes and shapes and colors and ages and genders and sexual orientations. We have a right to those differences because they are natural differences. Skin color is the result of your body's adaptation to the natural environment. It has nothing to do with being God's chosen children. People who are racist today, and white people, oh Lord, invariably, some white woman is going to come up to me, melanemic woman is going to come up to me in the next 3 days if I walk out of the house and somebody recognizes me. Some melanemic woman is going to say to me, I'm colorblind, I don't see color. And I'm supposed to say, oh, that's wonderful. I'm so glad you're so liberal. That's not what I'm going to say. I'm going to say, I knew that before you said it, because if you weren't colorblind, you wouldn't wear that shirt with those pants. And then she's going to get offended. How can you say that to me? You don't understand what I'm saying. I'm going to say, I understand exactly what you're saying. You're saying that skin color and other people makes you uncomfortable. So you just pretend that it isn't there. How can you? How dare you deny that you see the largest organ on a person's body, which is their skin? Inch by inch, the largest organ on your body is your skin. And when somebody says to you, when I see you, I don't see you black, you know damn well that they're lying. Because if they didn't see you what they call black, they wouldn't say black. They'd say, when I see you, I don't see you green. And then they'd be telling the truth. And you could say, well, I believe that. But when they say, I don't see you black, you're supposed to say, thank you. I will never forget the woman, the teacher in Texas, who stood up in a gymnasium at a meeting I was talking, and said among all these students to me, and I was talking, she wasn't supposed to interrupt me anyway, Miss Elliott, I just look for the person's heart. And I was supposed to say, oh, isn't that wonderful? You're willing to ignore people's skin color. Well, too bad for her, because I said, Madam, if you can see my heart from where you're standing, you should go down to the local hospital and volunteer to be their x-ray machine. You can save them a lot of money. She said, you don't know what I'm saying. I said, I know exactly what you're saying. You're saying that you're uncomfortable with somebody who has a different color skin, so you just pretend you look at their heart. Now, let me ask you something. Have you ever dressed a chicken? And she said, what do you mean? I said, that's what I thought. When you dress a chicken, you kill it, you cut it, take its feathers out, you singe it, you cut it open, and then you find their insides. And the insides of a chicken, like the insides of a human, are very colorful. If you want to get past colorful, you just can't look for their heart because you're going to have to go through lots of colors to get there. She said, I don't have to put up with this. I said, you're right, you don't. She stormed out of there because she exercised the freedom that she, as a melanemic woman, has the freedom to leave when somebody is making her uncomfortable because of something she just said out of her ignorance. Most women don't have that freedom, and very few people of color have the freedom, particularly at the college level, to walk out when the professor is saying something ignorant. How many of you, which of you two think that if you had stood up and said, you're out of your mind, to every teacher that started the year by saying, when I see people, I don't see people as black or brown or red or yellow. I just see people as people. Have you ever heard that out of a teacher's mouth?
Mm-hmm.
Because I hear it, I hear it all the time. Or when I see you, I don't see you black, or you all look the same to me. Anytime a teacher says that, she needs to look for another job. Because if she doesn't see, and some smart kid someday is going to stand up and say, when she says, I see people as black, I don't see people black or brown or red or yellow, I just see people as people. Somebody's going to stand up and say, do you see people who are white? And she's going to kick that kid out of the room, and he's liable to get kicked out of school. But it's time for us to start challenging the ignorant statements made by the educators in this country. It's time for us to refuse to allow teachers to say, when I see you, I don't see you black. And I absolutely never tolerate a teacher who says, you do really well for a black boy. Oh my God. How dare they? And we do it all the time, unless I'm very much mistaken.
No, we've heard it. We've dealt with it in school, and our children, unfortunately, we've dealt with it. I want to talk about when you begin educating and you begin your exercises, because obviously during the time that you began it, you were in the minority when it came to Caucasian people. I'm sure they didn't take that very lightly or take it happily. So how was some of the reaction, how was some of the backlash that you took when you began doing your work?
Well, the backlash that I got, I didn't mind because I figured what I was doing was right. My children were spit on, they were beaten, their belongings were destroyed, they were abused by their peers, by their teachers, and by some of the parents of the peers because my children had the town's only N-word lover for a mother. It was very, very ugly for my children. I didn't realize how bad it had gotten. I didn't mind that the teacher stopped speaking to me, or that they lied about me, or that they said ugly things almost in my hearing. I didn't mind that. I'd taken that before. But it made me really upset when the high school teacher came to me, whose husband was the elementary principal, came to me at a teachers meeting and said, Jane, you got to get your kids out of this school. I said, why? She said, because these teachers are trying to destroy your children. They're working hard at it. And that's when I decided, okay, my kids don't have to suffer for this. I'm getting them out of here. So we moved from that community. We moved 17 miles away because the kids didn't want to move at all because their absolute favorite person in the world was their grandfather, my father, who was an absolute fantastic human being. But they were taking a lot of abuse, and if I had kept them there, they would not have graduated from high school. My oldest son would have dropped out. He wouldn't have taken that forever. It would have been ugly. So we got him out, but I kept on teaching there. So the teachers didn't accomplish anything except to get my kids out of their reach, so they couldn't hurt my kids anymore, and they couldn't hurt me because I wasn't about to be bothered. I wasn't, you can say, I don't care what you say about me. I care how you treat me. I don't care what you say about other people, but you better not say it in my presence if you're talking out of ignorance. It didn't, see, people say to me now for the last year, people have said to me, what's it like to be socially isolated? I say, nothing new. I've been socially isolated ever since I did the blue-eyed, brown-eyed exercise in 1968. People will go out of their way not to be where I am. Melanemic people will. And I understand that because if I'm right, they're wrong. And how can 51 teachers be wrong and one teacher be right? Well, if you're teaching that there are several races, and if you're using Wikipedia, you can find a place in the Wikipedia where it says there are three races. People come Mongoloid, Caucasoid, and Negroid. Those are the three racial groups. And it's a lie. It isn't just a myth, it's a lie. We need to get that out of Wikipedia. I don't mind what you put on Wikipedia as long as you're telling the truth or something that resembles the truth, but that's a lie. It ought to be taken out of the Wikipedia. Somebody ought to excise that from that supposedly educational title.
How do you feel about reparations for Black Americans and others that especially in this country, they had to deal with the atrocities of, people who classify themselves as white?
Well, let me put it this way. I'm going to lose most of your black audience now, but this is the way it is. The first modern human beings that came to this continent came from Africa. And the people who are suffering the most from COVID are Native Americans who came from Africa. Now, if you're going to give reparations, we better start giving reparations to the people whom we raped, killed, murdered in various ways, and whose land we took. Let's start there. I'm all for reparations from there. Want to give them back the land? I don't think you want to. I don't think you would stand for that for an instant. But and you need to realize that they were the first Americans. We called them Indians because Columbus and other people didn't know where the devil they were. So they thought they were West Indies. They must be Indians. They weren't Indians. They aren't Indians. They'll never be Indians. They were from Africa, as we all were. So if we're going to start with reparations, let's make reparations to the first people, the first black people who came to this continent. Let's start with those people we call First Nations, because they were the First Nations. I doubt very much that there are unless you're in prison, and that's our new form of slavery in this country, is the prison industrial system. You know it as well as I do. But if you aren't in prison, you're probably not being enslaved, and you're probably not living on a dirt floor without any electricity, without any running water, without any central heating or cooling or air, and 100 miles from a hospital. But there are lots of Native Americans who are living in that very situation. And now somebody's going to say, we gave them the land. We gave them a postage stamp size of the land. We did not give them anything. We stole from them and gave very little back. If you're going to do reparations, let's do reparations for those folks first. I'm all for that. And I know now that that'll make a whole lot of people of color angry. But you have to, if you're gonna try to repair this situation, you better start where the worst damage has been done.
And what about the descendants of slavery?
I think the descendants of slavery deserve some kind of reparations, but I think the descendants of the First Nations deserve some kind of reparations too. And I think you can't do it for one without doing it for the other. And which one are you going to start with? Because you see, we tried to enslave Native Americans, but they would run away and get into the nearest village, and we couldn't tell them apart, so we couldn't tell which ones we had tried to enslave, and they got away. So we didn't start slavery with black people, what we call black people in this country. We started it with Native Americans. And we also brought indentured servants here from other countries to act as servants until they had worked long enough to pay back what it cost to bring them here and what they should have been paid while they were working. So that slavery didn't begin with people from Africa in this country. It began first with Native Americans, then with white folks, then with people of color, then with Africans.
We hear the word reparations being thrown around a lot, particularly in politics. And it looks like, I guess somebody got some information that Black people in America are looking for some reparations, because now we see that conversation. Well, would you offer it? Would you offer it? Would you offer it? Do you realistically see any type of reparation given to anybody in this country as we see it?
I think if you can prove that your people were one of those, was one of the families or a member of the family that was used unfairly, was enslaved, then that's one thing. But if you can't prove that, then that's another thing entirely. And I think practically every Native American in this country could prove it.
How would we
prove their names. Well, you can go through the what?
I'm sorry to cut you off. How will Black Americans prove that if records and things were destroyed and we don't really have any actual proof of that? How would we prove that?
I don't know, and neither do you. But you can't prove it by just the fact that your skin is very dark, because there are a whole lot of people who came here not enslaved, who came with very dark skin. And there have been a whole lot of people come to this country without coming here as slaves.
So my question would be, what's your motive? What was your motivation for teaching against racism when you first got started? Was it like a particular incident that got you, or was it just your life growing up that got you to start teaching out against racism?
What my father used to say to us when we were young, there were three daughters. My youngest daughter died at 3.5, but I had two sisters that were older than I was, Emma. And he would say to us, "Don't bring any pickaninnies into my house as grandchildren." And then my daughter married a man from Saudi Arabia. And before that, I did the blue-eyed, brown-eyed exercise with my kids in school, with my third graders. And this is what changed my father completely. I took the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, filmed in my classroom. The second year I did that exercise. The first year I did it, it was just the kids and me. And then the word got out, this awful thing that this horrible person had done with these little kids. And I did this exercise the following year, and the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation sent a film crew to film it. They took that film, they edited the film down to half an hour and threw it into a film about Eskimos in Canada and sent me a copy of the film. And I showed it to my parents in their home. And my father was sitting there in his blue bib overalls and his blue shirt with the sleeves rolled up to the elbow. And he was watching that film of those little white kids going through that exercise in racism, with the blue-eyed people being mistreated and the brown-eyed people being favored. He watched that for half an hour, and when it was over, he stood up, he took his red handkerchief out of the back pocket of his blue bib overalls, blew his nose, wiped his eyes, and said, "I wish somebody had taught me that when I was 9 years old." Now, I hadn't seen my father cry since I watched him cry after my little sister's death. But what he saw happening to those little kids, because of an exercise based on a physical characteristic over which they had no control, changed his idea about race and racism. At that moment, he said, "This has to stop." And he said to me later, when my mother was castigating me for doing such an awful thing to those children, he said, "Jane, you're sure you're right?" And I said, "Dad, I'm sure I'm right." He said, "Then by God, go ahead, let the sons of bitches complain." And they complained, and they did worse than complain. The other teachers tried to get me fired every year because I was what I was doing with those children. Every year, 30% of the parents would call the principal before school started and say, "Don't put my kid in Elliott's classroom. I don't want my kid in Elliott's classroom." I'll never forget the person who called and said, "I don't want my kid in that N-word lover's classroom, but I want him to learn to read, so put him in there anyway." And he put him in there, and the kid learned to read, because I can do that. I can teach that chair to read if it had a mouth. It was difficult to be treated as though I had done something totally insane, when what I had done was create a microcosm of society in my third grade classroom. I did, for one day for the brown-eyed people and one day for the blue-eyed people, what we have done to people of color in this country for the last 300 years. We don't put a stop to it in this country. We think that's the way it is. We think if you're white, you're all right. We continue to do it. We continue to tolerate it. We continue to protect it. We continue to go along with it. We continue to hire teachers to do it. I've heard horrible things said in front of students by teachers who get hired the next year. It was the kinds of things that are said by coaches on some basketball courts and on some football fields and on some wrestling mats should never be allowed to be said. And the coaches who are saying them should be fired immediately, because you can't teach about racism if you're practicing it in the wrestling room, or in the locker room, or on the basketball court, or on the football field. But if I had done the worst thing you could possibly do by treating my little third graders for one day the way we treat people of color for a lifetime in this country. And we don't wait until you're born. We start prenatally. A group of midwives, registered nurses, called me last year and asked me if I would speak to them. I said, "Why?" They said, "Because we work in delivery rooms." I said, "Look, I was delivered of 4 children in 5 years, but I don't know anything about medicine. I know about how a child gets delivered." She said, "That's not what we want to talk about. We want you to talk about racism." I said, "Why?" She said, "Because we know that children of brown and black mothers don't get the same treatment in the delivery room that children of white mothers do. And we're midwives so that we can go into the delivery rooms and deliver children and treat them all the same. She said, we can deliver these children away from the delivery room and they can get the same treatment if we're doing the delivery. Now, think about that. We don't start with you. We don't wait to start until after you're born. We do it to you before you're born. And then we don't stop after you're dead. There are still cemeteries in the United States of America where Black people are not allowed to be buried because those cemeteries are for whites only. Now, think about how ugly this is and how self-defeating it is and how much pain it has cost us and how much money it has cost us. However, you need to realize that the reason we perpetuate racism is because it is a moneymaker. You can build a prison. You can hire a bunch of people to guard the people in that prison, about 300 people. Communities like to have a prison come to their community because that's 300 people who didn't have jobs before they got there. And I have worked with some prison employees. And let me tell you, that's an interesting experience. But you need to see the film, A Class Divided. If you haven't seen it, get a copy of it and look at it. And look at what those people who are in the business of guarding people in the prisons talk like, the way they act, the way they think, and the things they are willing to do to maintain their position. We open a prison. We put you in prison for whatever crime we decide you have committed. And if you remember, 3 strikes, you're out. I do. That's another thing I remembered. Remember, the third crime that you commit can get you sent to prison. And in the prison, you can be forced to work for 8 hours a day for 22 cents an hour. The money that you make goes to the victim of your crime. Now, if there's no victim, where does the money go? If you force a person to work and furnish him food, lodging, and clothing, that's called slavery. Now, think about that. We have reinstituted slavery with the prison industrial system in the United States of America. And then you look at the percentage of people who are in prison who are people of color, particularly the males. And then you look at how easy it is for a melanatic person to go to prison for the same crime that a melanemic person can do and get a slap on the wrist. If you think that our justice system is just, you're wrong. And if you haven't read the book, y'all know the name of this book, so tell me what it is. Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow. Have you read it?
Yeah.
All right. Isn't this exactly what she says? And if you look around and you do just a little bit of just investigate a little bit, and you realize that she was right when she wrote the book, and she's right today. And what Bill Clinton did was cause a whole bunch, thousands of young Black males to go to jail. You can send your raw materials into a prison and have something produced at a whole lot less than it would cost you if you sent those materials overseas or did it in the public sphere instead of in the prison. Our prison system is not a just system. Criminal justice is an oxymoron. It's mostly criminal and damn little justice, particularly if you're a person of color.
Absolutely. The the exercise, the blue eye, brown eye exercise that you conducted in the 60s, right in the hills in the heat of the civil rights movement. I believe it was right after Dr. King was assassinated. Talk about the motivation behind doing
next
that.
Day.
Wow. So was it like enough was enough?
Yeah. No. Enough isn't enough. Enough is too damn much. Enough is too much. Don't say enough is enough to me when we're talking about racism. Any racism is wrong and it has to be stopped. It has to be stopped now for one really good reason. If we don't stop what white people, like melanemic people, have been doing to melanatic people all these years, if we don't stop it now, we're going to have nothing but chaos for the next 30 years as more and more melanemic, so-called white people get more and more upset about the fact that their jobs are going to depend on suiting the person who is their boss, and their boss is going to be a person of color. We've got to change this system, and we've got to change it now. Martin Luther King Jr. had been one of our heroes of the month, along with, unfortunately, George Washington, who owned slaves, Abraham Lincoln, The Republican Party is the party of Lincoln. Lincoln was part black, part white, and part Cherokee Indian. He was a Melungeon. You knew that, right?
Mhm.
And if you didn't know it, why didn't you know it? I think that's just fantastic. You need to realize that. He and two of our other heroes of that month were Davy Crockett, who was killed while he was fighting a war to take over part of the Mexicans' land, and Daniel Boone, who took the land from Native Americans and made it his own, because that's what we did in those days. Those are our heroes of the month in February, along with Martin Luther King Jr. Now, most of those heroes should not have been heroes in view of what they had done to people of color, but they were heroes for us. And here was Martin Luther King Jr., whom I thought was all about hope. And for me, hope is an acronym for holding on to positive energy. That's what he did. Even though that we sent him to jail, we put him in prison, we did everything we could to stop that man, and you couldn't stop him. So when he and Malcolm X got closer and closer together in their philosophy, I knew that they would have to die. Because if those two men and their followers had gotten together, they would have upset the apple cart in this country. Make no mistake about that. So they both had to die. And they did, and they were killed. And my kids had thought Martin Luther King was something special. I came home from school that night. We were learning the Indian unit, we're studying the Indian unit, and we were going to put the teepee that my previous third graders had made, put it up in my room. We were going to paint it with Indian symbols. I do the thing that you for the Indian unit. And as I came in the front door of my house, the telephone was ringing. I answered the telephone. It was my sister. She said, is your television on? I said, no. You better turn it on. Why? Because they shot him. I said, well, who'd we shoot this time? Because we had already shot a whole lot of people. And she said, Martin Luther King Jr. And then there was no more joking. And then there was no camaraderie. And then there was no, oh my God, not Martin Luther King Jr. You couldn't, how could you shoot? How could you shoot a man whose life was about bringing peace, whose life was about love, which I stopped believing in right after that. Because we use love in absolutely the wrong ways. After it was awful. I washed and dried the teepee. I spread it out on the living room floor. I started to iron it, and I was watching Walter Cronkite. He was interviewing three leaders of the black community, and he said to those three men, when our leader was killed, his widow held us together. Who's going to keep your people in line? Now, those were his exact words. When our leader was killed, I thought, oh my God, does he think that Martin Luther King Jr. was the JFK? Because he was talking about JFK. Our leader was the leader only of white people. His widow held us together. See how civilized we are? And then who's going to keep your people in line? As if your people and my people are different people. I was just furious. So I changed the channel, and there was Dan Rather saying to two leaders of two black males, don't you Negroes think you should feel sympathy for us white people because we can't feel the anger at this killing that you Negroes can? And at that point, I rolled that teepee up, I threw it into the bottom of the closet, and I closed the closet door, and I got my husband's supper. He worked nights at that time, and he came home, and he put his arms around me. He said, they killed him, didn't they? I said, yeah. He said, what are you going to do? I said, I'm going to, tomorrow, my students are supposed to learn the Sioux Indian prayer that says, oh, great spirit, keep me from ever judging a man until I've walked a mile in his moccasins. I'm going to arrange to have that answered for my children tomorrow. He said, Jane, what are you going to do? I said, I'm going to do what we do in this country every day. I'm going to separate my students according to a physical characteristic over which they have no control, and that's the color of their eyes. Eye color and skin color are caused by the same chemical, melanin. I'm going to separate my kids according to the color of their eyes, and I'm going to treat some of them the way we treat children of color in this country, and I'm going to treat the rest of them the way we treat white people. He said, you'll lose your job. I said, if I lose my job for doing the right thing, I don't want to teach her anymore. He said, we need the money. You better not do this. I said, I'm going to do it. He knew something I didn't know. He had ridden back and forth to work 25 miles from where we lived every day and back every night. And he had listened to the remarks that the men who lived in that area were making as he rode back, and they rode to and from work. And he had heard the things they were saying about Martin Luther King Jr. on the way home from work that night. And he knew that it was going to get ugly, And he knew that we were in big trouble if I did that exercise. I didn't know it. If I had known it, would I have done the exercise anyway? Oh, yeah, I probably would have. Yeah, I would have. Because as a teacher, I could have just let that go. As an educator, I couldn't. Because you see, the word educator comes from the root duc dus, which means lead, the prefix e, which means out, the suffix ate, which means the act of, and the suffix or, which means one who does. An educator is one who is engaged in the act of leading people out of ignorance. And you can't lead people out of ignorance if you're teaching them that if you're white, you're all right. If you're brown, hang around. If you're black, get black. You cannot lead people out of ignorance by doing that. And you can't lead them out of ignorance by teaching them that Christopher Columbus discovered America. You can't discover a place where people are already living. They discovered it before you got there. And this land was discovered by people from Africa about 10,000 years before Christopher Columbus was a gleam in his father's eye. We have been teaching the wrong thing long enough now. So I went to my classroom the next day, and my kids and I talked about this killing, and I asked them whether they had any idea how it would feel to be something other than white, and they didn't. Did they want to know? Yeah. It sounded like that. It'd be fun. So I said, well, we decided we could judge people by the color of their eyes. And we judged people by the color of the eyes for that day. First day, brown-eyed people were on top, blue-eyed people were on the bottom. I was unfortunate enough to be born blue-eyed. So after I got them all settled into the right places, the blue-eyed people in the back and the brown-eyed people in the front, I said, now, blue-eyed people aren't as smart as brown-eyed people, they're as clean as brown-eyed people, they aren't civilized as brown-eyed people. These are the things I've heard about black people all my life. And at that point, little 9-year-old Debbie sitting in the front row, brown-eyed 9-year-old Debbie, looked up at me and said, how come you're the teacher here if you got them brown eyes? Blue eyes. How come you're the teacher here if you got them blue eyes? And I thought, oh my God, there it is. That's how it works. Now she has the power to confront me, to argue with me, to challenge me because I have the wrong color eyes. I learned more that day than my students did. It was absolutely amazing. I learned about my students. I learned about my peers. When they found out what I was doing, I told them what I was doing in the teacher's lounge. One of the third grade teachers, about 54 at the time, said, I don't know how you have time for all that extra stuff. It's all I can do to teach reading, writing, and arithmetic. Well, she hadn't done that yet, as far as I was concerned. And the other one, who had been molding young minds in that community for over 30 years, said to me, on the day after Martin Luther King Jr. was killed, I don't know why you're doing that. I thought it was about time somebody shot that son of a bitch. Now you tell me how a woman with that attitude could possibly teach in a non-racist way. She couldn't, and she didn't. And so I was seen as a real problem among the staff, among the faculty from then on, because I would tell my students things that they should remember, and they would remember. In fact, when they got up to junior high, the junior high teacher came down to the lunchroom one day when my sister was substituting and said, the worst thing just happened in my classroom, and I don't know what to do about it. My sister said, well, what happened? She said, I used the N-word. She didn't say N-word. She said the word. And one of my students stood up and said, we don't use that word in this school. And if you're going to use it, I'm going to go out in the hall until you stop. She said, what would you have done? My sister said, well, I think I'd stop using that word. I thought that was a logical answer from my sister. She shouldn't have had to have a student shouldn't have had to tell that teacher, don't be using that word, and don't be using that word in the context in which you just used it. Unless you're a person of color, you don't have the right to use that word. She was furious. But my kids my former students would challenge you at the drop of a word. And that's a good thing. That's a good thing. If teachers don't know, somebody has to teach them. If you don't know enough to keep your mouth shut in that situation, then you have to suffer the slings and arrows of outraged students who will stop you. And that's what my former students used to do on a regular basis.
Now, at that time, were you teaching predominantly Caucasian classes, or was there a mixture in there?
No, they were all, well, but you see, if we all trace our DNA back as far as we could, we'd find out that we all have a percentage of DNA that came from a country in Africa. Right. So you call them Caucasian. I don't call them Caucasian. I call them, they didn't all come from the Caucasus Mountains. If people had evolved in the Caucasus Mountains, they wouldn't have lived through the first winter. Come on. That's the only way that could happen, is if you were in a very, very hot climate where there was lots of food and lots of water and lots of shelter. Let's get over that idea. No, I was teaching in an all Melanin community.
Okay.
And they were absolutely convinced that that's the only kind of people who should be in that community. And what's interesting about that is, for many years, Iowa has had the first primary elections. You know, we're always the first in the country to have our primary.
Mm-hmm.
They are now deciding that they aren't going to let Iowa do that maybe this year. In 2022, they are going to have somebody else start because there's so little diversity in Iowa. This non-diversity thing is going to bite them where it hurts. They need to realize that they better start importing some people of color, because people of color can give you some advantages now that you simply can't have if your people are all melanemic. It's already reaching that point. I think it's absolutely fabulous.
How do we solve the issue of racism, and what should people who classify themselves as white, what should be their duty to make sure that we eradicate racism?
Start teaching the truth. We need to start teaching the truth. We need to start telling our children. We need to read the book Nile Valley Contributions to Civilization.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody has to read the book Nile Valley Contributions to Civilization. Have you read it?
I have.
Because if you haven't, I don't want to know it. Don't tell me. Don't tell me. I don't want it. Anthony Browder wrote the book Nile Valley Contributions to Civilization. You read that book and you will realize that 4,000 years before the birth of Jesus Christ, people in Africa, in Egypt, a country in Africa, were doing cataract surgery with metal instruments before there was such a thing ever heard of in Asia or Europe or the Americas. 4,000 years before the birth of Jesus Christ. And then you say Jesus Christ, and then you think of what it says in the Bible. He had kinky, woolly hair and feet of bronze. When was the last time you saw a Jesus that was other than pale face with long brown hair? Mm-hmm. You see, what we melanemic people do, one of the major differences between what we call white people and what we call black and brown people is, when white people come into a new environment, they immediately adjust the environment to fit their needs. And look what we've done and everywhere we've gone. Yep. When people of color come into a new environment, they immediately adjust their needs to fit the environment. It protects the environment and it keeps the people alive. They adjust their needs to fit the environment. We have even done that with the Bible. In the Bible, it says, and now abideth these three, faith, hope, and charity. And the greatest of these is charity. Charity means selfless giving. Now we've changed that verse to, and now abideth these three, faith, hope, and love. And the greatest of these is love. Love and charity are not synonymous. Get that into your heads. Love and charity are not synonymous. But if you believe in selfless giving, it's going to cost you. It's going to cost you some money. So just change it to love so it doesn't cost you anything. And you can do what I remember my father whipping us. He lined the five of us up. There were five that were all born within 8 years. And then 2 trailers came later on. But he lined the five of us up after my mother had tattled on us because she couldn't control us. So she'd tell my dad, they did this and this. He'd say, all right. So he'd go get a lilac stick off the lilac bush and he'd strip the sleeves off it, and he'd come in and he'd whip every one of us. Start with my older brother right down to me and my younger brother. And the rest of them would take it. And I'd scream because I didn't want to get hit. And he'd say, Mom, she said, and she'd say to us, he's doing this because he loves you. Mm-hmm. And I would think, Dad, could you love us a little less? But I didn't dare say it because I knew I'd get a whole lot more love if I said it. You see, we have used the word love to cover up some of the most ungodly acts you can possibly imagine. And you need to realize that we're going to keep right on doing it until somebody says, hold it right there. You say that you love me. I say that I love my children. I also would be inclined to say that I love brownie pudding with ice cream. I don't feel about brownie pudding with ice cream the way I feel about my children, my grandchildren, my 2 great-grandsons. I don't feel the same way about them. We use words very carelessly in this country, as they do everywhere. But you need to remember that words are the most powerful weapon devised by humankind. We use words to destroy people all day, every day. I have watched teachers do it. and knew that they were doing it, and they knew they were doing it. But as teachers, they did and said things that were so much worse. And they did it on a daily basis to kids that they had heard about in the teacher's lounge. It's insane. If teachers can't keep their mouths shut in the teacher's lounge about their children, there should be a sign over the door of every teacher's lounge in the United States of America, and it should say, "Caution, contents herein may be hazardous to students' health." Horrible expectations are laid down in teachers' lounges by teachers about their former or present students. If you can't teach a kid, find another job. But don't say, "That child just cannot learn. He doesn't want to learn. He cannot learn." The child can probably learn if he's treated properly. Here is something you have to hear. Julian Bond said, "Black children going to violence is Black children going to school for 12 years and receiving 6 years worth of education." And he's absolutely right. And Gwendolyn Brooks said, "Truth tellers are not always palatable. There's a preference for candy bars. People would rather hear what I say said in a nicer manner, and less truculently and less aggressively." Well, I can't think of a nice way to say that somebody is a racist, sexist, ageist, homophobic, ignorant fool. I can't think of a nice way to say that. And I certainly wouldn't vote for him. But that's what's been going on in this country for the last 4 years. We found out what happens if you don't recognize it, describe it, define it, and refuse to tolerate it. Elie Wiesel said you must not tolerate the intolerable. If something is intolerable for somebody else, it ought to be intolerable for you. And he also says you have the right to forgive others for what they do to you. You don't have the right to forgive them for what they do to others. I don't have the right to forgive the cops who held George Floyd down and killed him with a knee on his neck. I don't have the right to forgive them for that, and neither do you. And he's dead, so he can't. And his relatives don't have to. But that one scene convinced a whole lot of people who are melanemic that people who are melanotic have been telling us the truth all these years. Now, white people can't deny that it's happening anymore because it was right there in front of their eyes, and there's no way to deny that it's happening. And he isn't the first person it's happened to, and he won't be the last. But at least people of all kinds got out in the streets and protested what went on there. That might have been the best thing that happened in this country in the last 3 years, because now it takes away white people's ability to deny what is really happening to people of color.
Appreciate it.
Absolutely. We definitely appreciate your time, Miss Elliott. The hour that you've given us has been educational and powerful, to say the least. Thank you very much for your time. As we depart, is there anything that you want to leave our audience to kind of think about? Any books that we should recommend? I've been writing down the books if I didn't read them as you've been saying them. But if you may, please, the floor is yours. We thank you.
Go to my website, download the printed learning materials. The first is a set of typical statements that white folks make that think they ain't being racist. Go through these, and I'm talking to white people on this. Most of you people of color know all these and know what your reaction to them is. Then go to the clarifications of those statements, how they are perceived by people who are on the receiving end of them. Then go to the commitments to combat racism. People are always saying, "Well, you brought us a lot of problems. You didn't bring us any solutions." Oh yeah, there's a set of commitments to combat racism. Go through them, check yes, those that you have done, check no, those that you haven't done. Then go back, circle that you check no, put the date beside it, and do it for a month. And it will change the way you the way you see your world. Then go to the bibliography and read every book on that bibliography under race. Because while we discriminate against people for their religion and people for their sexual orientation and for their age and a lot of things, the number one problem in this country is racism. It is the number one problem holding this country down, and it will be the number one problem in the future for this country as more and more people become less and less important. As more and more people of browner skin get jobs and get in positions where they are the bosses, more and more people with less melanin are going to get more and more upset and more uncomfortable and more vicious. And that's exactly what's happening right now. When you talk about the Oath Keepers and QAnon and KKK and the Proud Boys, oh, good Lord. The people who welcomed Jesus into this world were not proud boys. They were 3 wise men. And what we need in this country are wise men and women. We do not need proud boys unless you have something to be really proud of. And being a boy, when you're 35 or 40 years old, is not something to be proud of. And we need to realize that. And we need to realize that that's the kind of person that T-Rump praises and says, stand back, but stand by. Be careful who you listen to, people. Words are the most powerful weapon devised by humankind. You'd better be careful of the people you listen to.
Appreciate it. Definitely appreciate you stopping by the program today. Much success in your endeavors in the future as well.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, and much success in your endeavors. And I hope you still have some listeners.
Oh, we will.
Oh, yeah, we will. They appreciate it. They'll appreciate you, and we definitely appreciate you as well. Miss Elliott on the podcast, thank you very much. Take care.
Well, thank you.
Take care.
All right.
You're most welcome. Bye now.
Bye-bye.